Session Doji goes to the top of the cliff and jumps off. And just as he's about to enter the demon's open mouth, the demon turns into the god Taishaku, the Buddhist god Taishaku. And he catches Session Doji and he puts him gently on the ground. And then he bows to him and he says, "In order to test you, I held back the Buddha's teachings for a time, causing anguish in the heart of a bodhisattva. I hope you will forgive my fault and save me without fail in my next life." And so here's this demon who is really this Buddhist god, and he's testing Session Doji to make sure that he's ready. But it's this interplay, this really complex relationship between all of us. How did Session Doji know, or did he know, that this demon was really a Buddha, right? And then the Buddha, to test Session Doji, says to him, well, I hope in next lifetime, because he knows next lifetime, maybe Session Doji is going to be the teacher, and he's going to be the student. And he hopes that, based on cause and effect, that next lifetime, Taishaku will help him attain enlightenment. And this is like such the basic premise of Buddhism, that we are all Buddhas, right? We look at the golden images of the Buddha, which people made from, their devout reverence, for the memory of the Buddha. But it kind of sets us apart. It kind of gives us the impression that he was this perfect being. And actually many times, when we make a vow, we make a determination to do something, and something immediately comes up, right, to kind of stop us, that event or person is our teacher. It's usually our teacher, right? So how do we know that they're not the Buddha? How do we know that the person giving us the most grief and aggravation, in our family, in our jobs, when we're driving our car, the guy who cuts you off and he's on the cell phone and doesn't even notice you, so I say honk the horn and then bow to them as the Buddha. and really see everybody as the Buddha, not like, well, next lifetime you'll become enlightened, so I'll let you cut me off. But really to understand this complex relationship of lifetime, after lifetime. And when the Buddha, did anybody see the Channel 13 show they had called The Buddha? Did anybody watch that? So it was really a great show, and I recommend everybody to watch it. But the Buddha, actually, when he was born, he was named Siddhartha, right? So Siddhartha grew up as a prince, and he lived in this kingdom of the Shakyas. So Shakyamuni, we call him. He was the family of the Shakyas. And he was a prince, and the kingdom was like a medium-sized kingdom. In India, there were 17 kingdoms. They were like separate little kingdoms, and at various times they all fought against each other. At various times they were at peace. But he lived in the north in this little kingdom, and he lived in this palace, with his father, the king. And like every good father, he expected his son to kind of grow up and be the next king, take over the family business. And Siddhartha was raised to do that. And then, as the story goes, he kind of ran away 4 times, and he saw all the suffering that was going on among the people, right? He saw the suffering of birth, the suffering of sickness, the suffering of old age, and the suffering of death. And he would see these sufferings, and then he'd go back to the palace and kind of see like this wonderful life that he was living. And he couldn't understand why. Why am I living, this life with such preferential treatment, but outside there are people suffering? Why is there suffering? How come I'm not suffering? Why are they suffering? What's the cause of suffering? And finally, how can we stop suffering? How can I stop suffering? And he made a vow that he was going to leave the palace and he was going to dedicate his life to answering this question. How could he eliminate human suffering? Right? So very similar, to Session Doji making that vow. And so he leaves, and at that time in India, there were like all these little groups of men, basically, who had left their family life seeking what some kind of enlightenment. And so he joined up with a few of these different groups, and for 6 years, he lived the life of an ascetic, which meant he ate very little. You know, basically you could kind of see all his bones, right? He would beat himself. He would stay in these tortured poses for days. You know, some of these men would tie rocks to like their tongue and, you know, try to withstand the pain of that for a long period of time. And they would meditate, and they would do all these kind of aesthetic practices in hopes of gaining enlightenment. Well, after about 6 years, you know, one night Shakyamuni is sitting there going, well, I'm not really any further along than I was when I started 6 years ago, right? So he said, something must not be right. This must not be the right path. So he remembers his original vow, and he realizes he has to change. He has to kind of change direction. And at that moment, when he determined he was going to change direction, a girl from the local village came by and gave him a bowl of food. And it was like the first food he had eaten in days. So he eats this food, and he sits back down to meditate, and so he sits down to meditate, reawakening his vow, right, that he was going to attain this enlightenment. And he said, it was once more the night of the full moon, and he made a vow, let only skin, sinew, and bone remain, let the flesh and blood dry in my body, but I will not give up this seat without attaining complete awakening. And then he went into this deep, deep meditation, and the story goes, what he recounts later on, is that the devil, Satan, in Buddhist mythology, it was Lord Mara, started to attack him in his mind, right? And trying to sway him from getting into this